so I'm very pleased to be able to welcome Orla Lynch to come and talk to us. Orla those of you who've been around longer than I have know that there's in fact a very natural connection between social psychology and international relations. And this is even stronger for Orla, who actually self-identifies on the webpage as a social psychologist. So we really kind of feel a sense of connection and that Orla really belongs to us in some sense. Orla did a lot of her training. She did some studying here at St Andrews, in fact, so a long-term connection back here to St Andrews, and then in Ireland, and then back here in St Andrews in international relations. So Orla's working on a number of research projects that involve looking at essentially the process of radicalisation and violence, but also with a kind of community focus, which I think is very interesting. And in fact, the last time, when Steve and I last chatted to Orla, she was in her car in the middle of Ireland, chatting to us with Skype on an iPad. So we're really pleased to have Orla speaking to us today on what radicalisation is not.
Thanks, Ken. Excuse the grammar, but I think you might get the point from the title. Yeah, my background is applied psychology is where I'd see myself coming from, but for the last 7 years I've been working in the International Relations Department, and within that department in St Andrews we have a research unit called the Centre for the Study of Terrorism and Political Violence. So that's where I'm situated, and at the moment we're working on 2 projects. One project looks at service provision for victims of terrorism, and the next project, which is more related to this work, is looking at what we're calling a victim-perpetrator complex. So the idea that there are no simplistic definitions for perpetrators and victims in political violence, that it's a lot more complex, that there's a circular relationship that can be identified in certain divided societies around victims of terrorism. But this project is based on some earlier work that looked at Muslim youth communities in the UK and Ireland, and looking at comparing both situations. But what I'm going to present today is a little bit about the UK situation. So why am I talking about what radicalisation is not? As I said, as Ken said, I do see myself as a social psychologist. However, as a social psychologist tainted by international relations, I might not be talking to the same concepts that you're talking to. So I do find myself in front of a difficult audience in that I'm sure that I am open to challenge on some of my psychological concepts, but what I aim to do in my work is to bring psychology to international relations. Now, psychology does feature, and as Ken said, there should be a natural relationship between psychology and international relations. However, there isn't, and I believe there is not a natural relationship because psychology is poorly used and poorly understood in international relations. So my understanding of the problem is that psychology is poorly applied. It's misused, and there's kind of a black box phenomenon around the use of psychology in IR. So it's almost like something happens around the individual or the group. We won't worry a whole lot about that, and we'll take concepts from the Psych 101 course and we'll apply them generally. Doesn't matter too if it's a group or an individual, they mean something. And you have a very, very poor track record of psychology being applied appropriately within international relations. So coming from psychology and wanting to understand a little bit about radicalisation, the reality is there's things we can know and there's things we cannot know. Can we know about radicalisation in terms of what radicalisation means in London? Can we know what radicalisation means in terms of Islamic radicalisation in London? Is there such a thing as radicalisation? We won't get started on that because we don't have all day. But what we can know about is the 99.9% of Muslim youth who do not engage in radical behaviour, who do not behave in takfiri jihadism, in mujahideen attacks, whatever you want to call it. We know there's a huge population out there who do not engage in that type of behaviour. This way? It's going to work? Okay. Okay, so it was working a minute ago. Okay, so what am I going to talk about? I'm going to talk about things like the construction of identity by British Muslim youth in the aftermath of 9/11, or using 9/11 as a frame. the public construction of Muslim youth as threatening, as the other, as folk devils of British society, as an existential threat to Britishness, to a way of being. I'm going to talk about how the participants in this study incorporate these problematic notions of being a Muslim youth into their day-to-day realities. And very importantly, we're going to try and understand how situatedness is important to that. And what I mean by that is public and private spaces, how they're important to understanding the story. So what have those got to do with radicalization? It's exactly the point. The point is, I'll try this again. Okay, it's working. They shouldn't have anything to do with the notion of radicalization, but in fact they do. Within international relations, and more specifically within what might be called terrorism studies, which debatable whether or not it's actually a field of studies, but there are a number of assumptions that inform people's views on what terrorism is, what radicalization is, etc. Now, of course, there's an assumption we're making here is that there is somehow a relationship between radicalization and terrorism. That's another debate. That's also questionable. In different contexts, the answer is absolutely certainly that radicalization is not necessary for terrorism. But there is a basic assumption when we're talking about Islamic radicalization that that somehow is related to terrorism. But we'll get to that later. This is some of the literature that talks about radicalization amongst Muslim youth in the UK. You can see there a belief that radicalization is a growing problem amongst diaspora Muslim youth. First point you'd make is that the people that we're talking about here are not diaspora, they're British Muslims. So that's the first issue. The alienation that the children and grandchildren of Muslim emigres feel, which leads them to radicalization and thus political and social violence. Post is Gerald Post, former CIA, he's a psychiatrist. He was responsible for that piece of work. Major assumption, not evidence-based. There's no empirical research to back that up. Another quote from the literature, membership of Al-Qaeda as a part of an effort to defy one's parents. Again, not evidence-based, but these are common assumptions, unquestioned, the little critique of these in the literature, as an effort to challenge the purity of their parents' religious convictions. So this is not a joke. These are, very serious statements that actually have impact and influence what we think about in terms of radicalization, and quite problematically influence what we think about in terms of what and how people become involved in terrorism. So, what we have here, and what's very important to understand, is that we're not just talking about radicalization here, we're not just talking about a pathway to violence. Since 9/11, since Muslim youth became the scapegoat for all security issues that the British state has experienced, we have a very complex interweaving of issues like immigration, of issues like assimilation, of issues like integration. All of these issues have become securitized. So in 1990s, what were essentially issues around social housing, issues around poverty, issues about socioeconomic status, all of a sudden after 9/11, these were issues about security. These were issues about terrorism, about potential radicalization. So Muslim youth who were seen as isolated, first of all, they wouldn't have been Muslim youth in the 90s, they would have been Kashmiri, Pakistani, whatever it happened to be. All these youth who were now being labeled as Muslim, their experiences were viewed through a securitized lens. They were spoken about in the language of risk. So what was normal social process, normal developmental process for immigrant families or for third and fourth generation British Muslims now became issues around threat and risk, securitization and terrorism. One of the most annoying questions, and I'll get on to what the participants actually said, one of the most annoying questions was, are you British first or Muslim first? Those were the type of research questions that were being asked of Muslim youth in the UK, more particularly after 7/7. And the responses were given in order to be antagonistic. So the response was, well, if you're going to force me into it, I'm going to be Muslim first. It meant absolutely nothing. It wasn't a measure of any loyalty. It was a measure of fitting in. The Pew poll, which was a Pew poll carried out, I think, in 2006 and replicated in 2010, asked that very question, are you British first or Muslim first? This was picked up on by some academics who were actually psychologists and said that this was evidence of the nature of Muslim youth in the UK, when in fact it was evidence of the response to the policy and the treatment of Muslim youth in the UK. So really the methodologies, the effort at empirical work around this community was really very, very poor. What we saw was closing down of identity options. So you have a situation where I said you had Indian, Kashmiri, Pakistani, Arab, whatever it happened to be. All of these people all of a sudden were becoming Muslim. So there was kind of hardening of categories. So that, in one sense, did close down identity options. But the interesting parallel to that was while identity options were being closed down due to the perceptions of Muslims after 9/11, Muslim youth themselves were seizing that label and reimagining it in their favor. So they were taking the label Muslim, they were embracing that label Muslim, and they were making it their own. Okay. So again, just referring back to the literature, the construction of Muslim youth in the literature was a significant factor in motivating me to do this research. What I found was going on is that normal developmental process, unrelated to being Muslim, unrelated to the immigrant experience, normal developmental process was securitized. Normal developmental process was pathologized. So whereby the language of identity opening, the language of cognitive opening were being used and problematized when it was related to Muslim youth, whereas when it came to other mainstream populations, it would have just been normal developmental issue. Identity became a risk factor. So the notion of needing to be more British, the notion of needing to fit in further, needing to integrate or assimilate, that became a major issue for Muslim youth. And most problematically, the notion of susceptibility to radicalization became really important. So after 9/11, what we witnessed was a frantic effort to try and understand what this notion of radicalization was. Who were these people that participated in violence? Initially, we had an assumption that various sects of Islam were responsible, whether it was Salafi, whether it was Wahhabism, that these rare and extreme groups were responsible for the violence. And as it became clear that that wasn't the case, that these groups weren't solely responsible, it became the case that something about Islam must be provoking these youth. And then it evolved further into something about these youth and Islam must be causing the violence. And eventually we ended up with a situation whereby Muslim youth became the suspect community, that every member, mostly male, every member of the Muslim male youth community had the potential to be somehow radicalized. And that's, of course, Muslim youth male in the West. Two authors there, Keppel and Roy, their thesis, or well, their hypothesis is that, in fact, it's a feature of Muslim youth in the West that they have the potential to be radicalized. So these are common features of the literature. These are the assumptions that were abound about being Muslim after 9/11. You can see here from Baroness Warzai, she talks about Islamophobia passing the dinner table test, that it's now acceptable to talk about Islam and terrorism, that it's no longer seen as racism or Islamophobia, that's just the way it is, and we can talk about that from now on. And that's something that the people in the study reflected on. They reflected on the fact that it's no longer a problem for people to approach them or to challenge them about being Muslim and its somehow relationship to terrorism or radicalization. I think this quote demonstrates that in response to the way that Muslim youth were constructed after 9/11, the British government were absolutely at fault in the way they dealt with the issues. The use of fear was important. They talk about binding themselves through fear rather than through hope. They talk about muddying the waters around what radicalization was, including issues of immigration, including socioeconomic issue, including issues of isolation and poverty relating to housing. All of those issues became securitized and they became the problem. One issue that's absolutely absent from the rhetoric is the notion of foreign policy. There is no acknowledgement that foreign policy can somehow be, not responsible because responsible is the incorrect word, but can somehow be a factor in this debate. Speaking to the youth in the study, foreign policy is central. The notion of victimhood is central due to foreign policy. But the strategy for dealing with this issue of radicalization was to bring in, like I said, socioeconomic, immigration issues, etc. So where does this leave us in terms of understanding radicalization in Muslim youth? First of all, the same literature is applied to Muslim youth in the UK, Muslim youth in the US, Muslim youth in Ireland, Muslim youth in France. The same type of literature around radicalisation is applied. Similarly, when we're talking about radicalisation, people also try to apply it to Belgian youth who are travelling to Syria. So it's across the board. People are looking for a universal process that occurs across the board, with Islam being the unifying factor. However, we're still at the same point. We've little critical challenge to the treatment of Muslim youth in the literature. There was a rapid evidence assessment by Bruhana and Wickstrom, and they looked at all of the research on radicalisation that had an empirical basis, and out of 4,000 documents, something like 16 could be included in terms of the quality of their empirical work. So the quality of the work is very, very poor. It comes down to things like the sample size is so small. They're very much inaccessible sample, especially if it's suicide terrorism. So all of those issues make it very, very difficult. But the number of assumptions that underlie the empirical work are so problematic that we can't seem to move forward. Apart from the academic literature at all, there is government scapegoating of Muslim communities, and evidence of that was the Preventing Extremism Together initiative that the government enacted in 2006, which was a community consultation process. However, the communities that were consulted felt that it was a scapegoating exercise and that they did not know what extremism was. They did not know what radicalisation was. They had no idea how to point it out, how to prevent it in their communities, and so they felt like the finger was being firmly pointed at them. They also had the experience of being told that they must become more British, they must integrate more, they must be less isolated, and that became a problem for them. Manipulation of tangentially related political issues in an opportunist manner. Evidence of that, give you an example, if you look at the number of bills passed through Parliament after 9/11 that were related to immigration that were failed to pass before 9/11, you then see how everything was securitized so that the ends justified the means, because it was about national security and it was about an existential threat to Britishness. It was no longer merely a security threat. I mean, very problematically, and not a useful way to look at terrorism and radicalisation, is the number of deaths over the past number of years from radicalisation or terrorism, if you want to relate them. And that's not a strategic threat. It's not a strategic threat in the same way that the dissident Republicans in Northern Ireland might feature as a particular threat. However, it's framed as an existential threat to British society in that it's framed as a threat to notions of Britishness, to a way of life, to a way of being. And there was a quote by Tony Blair that said something like, British Muslims are the community most in need of integration. And so that was somehow then related to the process, inverted commas, of radicalisation and eventually terrorism. We've no empirical knowledge on what radicalisation actually looks like. Does it even exist? Is it something we need to be thinking about? There's no empirical evidence on what factors are significant in understanding the difference between those Muslim youth who do and do not engage in violence. There are no factors that we can identify as particular to the group of individuals who carry out violent attacks. That's an ongoing issue in terrorism studies. Initially, it was the effort at identifying psychopathology. There must be something about these people who carry out attacks that makes them different. We must be able to identify them. When the issue of psychopathology was refuted, then there was issues around clinical symptoms. So they didn't quite have a syndrome, but they had elements of a syndrome. After that, you had personality traits or elements of a personality disorder. And it went on, constantly looking for the examples that would differentiate the radicals from the rest of us. The FBI are very good at doing this. They had profiling. Profiling didn't work. They now have psychological autopsies. Anything, again, that they can use a pattern to identify these people. There's a quote in a book by John Horgan. He did research in Northern Ireland with the former paramilitaries. And one of the paramilitaries said, well, we couldn't have those crazies in our organisation. You know, they're quite aware of the need to have a strong organisation, a strong group. They're quite aware of the need that to know when you have a clandestine organisation that security is important, that people who can handle the stress and the pressure, it's quite important. So it's not very helpful. A recent book that was published in actually last year claims to have the answer to suicide terrorism, and that is that they're suicidal. And that's the answer. I think the book is called the myth of martyrdom. And it says, the book opens by saying, all of these terrorism experts have said that terrorists are not psychopathological or they don't have any clinical symptoms. However, the reality is they're all suicidal. And that literally is the entire hypothesis. So we're going round and round in circles. We're reinventing the wheel constantly. We're talking about psychology and terrorism. Every time there's something new, we seek to understand it in a new way. So lone wolf terrorism, new terrorism after 9/11, catastrophic terrorism, CBRN, or chemical, radiological, nuclear terrorism, all of those things are new. And so we reinvent over and over and over again our responses and our way of thinking about terrorism. However, going back, both related to the government treatment of Muslim youth after 9/11, particularly 7/7 in the UK, but also the academic treatment of the topic, the uncritical nature of analysis, we have what you could reasonably say is Muslim youth being created as the other in British society. This was not lost on some of our more interesting politicians. Nick Griffin from the British National Party, he said, we should be positioning ourselves to take advantage for our own political ends of the growing wave of public hostility to Islam currently being whipped up by the mass media. So we were doing the job of the British National Party PR executives. Okay, so what did I want to do? What I wanted to do was to provide, and I use this term very loosely, a control study. I wanted to take the items that were predominant within the radicalization literature that were seen to be causal, or at least a correlational relationship between Muslim youth and radicalization, and ask those questions of the mainstream Muslim population. So take the ideas and wonder, did they mean something for the mainstream Muslim youth, or were these something that actually did apply to radicalization? So I took a sample of non-violent, self-defining, non-radical British Muslim youth. Youth was defined as 18 to 25. We had 70 participants and 30 youth worker participants. So looking at an overview, these people were slightly older. So what are the causal, or what's assumed to be the causal factors when we're thinking about radicalization? In the literature on terrorism studies, in the literature around radicalization in the UK, one of the key themes is the issue of they're homegrown. And again, it's the same issue. Homegrown, for 30 and 40 years, we've had homegrown terrorists in the UK, Northern Ireland, all of those individuals are homegrown, but this is a new term that applied to Islamic radicals in the UK. The issue of homegrown is, again, an effort to differentiate. So you had labels like British born or British educated. So the kind of distancing rhetoric used, constantly differentiating between the mainstream and the other. And a history of immigration was seen as a really important element in this story. We might be talking about second, third, fourth generation British Muslims. However, their immigration history is central to the story about why they got involved in doing what they did. Notions of vulnerability is very important, and that's talked about in the language of triggers and lures. I talked earlier about who is vulnerable, and the way the literature is structured, everybody's vulnerable, particularly males. Identity crisis and cognitive opening are two issues that are also used very commonly when we're talking about radicalization in the UK. Elements of crisis, adolescent years, issues to do with intergenerational conflict, all of those are associated with this process of radicalization. Importantly, loyalty to notions of a global community versus a statehood. And what we're talking about here is the notion of the ummah, which is, the best way I understand it, is almost a romantic notion of an attachment to global Muslims, a kind of brotherhood of religious compatriots around the world. And the issue being, and this is one of Keppel and Roy's positions, the issue being that if your loyalty is external, if your loyalty is outward looking, then it's less of a British identity and more of a transnational identity, and that somehow is deemed to be a problem in this situation as well. And that's the transnational identity features. So one of the things that becomes quite important is the rejection of a British identity in favour of some global Muslim identity, but we'll get on to why that exists as an issue. Transgenerational conflict, again, normal developmental process being problematized in this context. Perceptions of injustice. That's a major, major feature in the radicalization literature. Somehow the assumption that individuals who have problems with political behavior, have problems with social issues, that they are more likely to be radicalized or more susceptible to becoming involved in violence than others. Disenfranchised youth, that was a buzzword for the Daily Mail. Constant referral to the fact that undereducated, poor attainment overall, low socioeconomic status, isolated in particular geographic locations, that's Muslim youth, that was part of the story. Now, Muslim youth in the UK are one of the most underprivileged sections of community. It is true there's low educational attainment. It is true that they are isolated a lot of the time from the mainstream, but that's a feature of the entire population rather than a feature of anything specific. And then, of course, a radical ideology was part of the story. Within terrorism research, a radical ideology is always part of the story. However, the question is, does it come before or after? Is it a justification or is it a motivator? I tend to think that it comes after, if at all, and not always necessary. So that's the type of picture that we get from looking at the literature on terrorism. 5 ways that this is done. Some of the key authors do this. Islamic-centric approaches, the problem is Islam. That's the issue that we need to be concerned with, and that's how we need to understand this, so ideology being key. Contextual process approaches, individual psychology, group psychology, the interaction of both, and social movement theory, framing theory, the likes of Sageman, often called the bunch of guys theory. Psychological approaches, the likes of John Horgan and Andrew Silk, looking at push and pull factors, looking at process factors, looking at becoming involved and socialization pathways into violence. And also then a youth process. So some element in the development of youth that allows an opening for this radicalization. So that's what the literature says about radicalization. How do we do this study? The study was essentially an ethnographic grounded theory. Why was it an ethnographic grounded theory? Initially, the attempt was to do semi-structured interviews. However, access was difficult to the communities, but more importantly, there was a very, very much a sensitivity around the questions that were being asked. The participants were primed for answers. So, for example, I'd go and say, "So, tell me a bit about yourself," and they literally would say, "Well, I'm Muslim," or "Well, I'm more Muslim than I'm British," or something along those lines, very much primed for the arguments. Any mention of identity was almost a threatening kind of experience, so that just did not work. So what it ended up being was participant observation, living in, field research, personal diaries, and after a number of months of doing that type of work, then it was possible to go ahead and do semi-structured and unstructured interviews. So the ethnography was essential to the background. To get the access that I got, it was essential to have that kind of personal relationship with the people. And in order, because this type of work wasn't really done before, grounded theory allowed that open-ended analysis to be conducted. I know you can't see this, but this gives an example of the coding. It's just an in vivo report, so you can see the line by line, or actually that's node coding all the way up to, you can see in the top corner some of the key themes that emerged. So what I have here is the key themes and the analysis. I don't know that a triangle is the most helpful way of thinking about this, but these themes flow down and they inform each other each step. However, this grand narratives theme could possibly also be at the top, so just to bear that in mind. So what are the results? When I applied those factors that are supposedly key to understanding radicalization, when I applied that to a mainstream Muslim youth population, what did I find out? Found out that 9/11 is absolutely a key marker in an individual's time frame. So the youth spoke about before and after 9/11. So life began and ended at 9/11 in terms of how they categorize events. In terms of its impact on their life, whether or not it actually had an impact, they define it as such. So what happened before 9/11 was kind of unrelated to what happened after. I think one of the interesting things about that was even the youth workers who were on the whole older and perhaps had greater recall of events pre-9/11 did the same thing. They talked about before and after 9/11. They talked about identity changing. I mean, I think one of the quotes was, "I'm not a taxi driver anymore, I'm a Muslim taxi driver." So everything was seen as different. But the interesting thing about that is that these changes were already underway. So these things were happening already. Categories were hardening. People were taking ownership of Muslim categories. Second, third, and fourth generation British Muslim youth were embracing Islam in a more fundamentalist way than their parents did. And when I say a fundamentalist way, I don't mean in any pejorative sense. I mean a fundamentalist way in that they sought to understand Scripture and use their knowledge of Scripture more literally in their understanding of Islam. One of the important things about before and after 9/11 was the issue of an awakening. So the possibility of being Muslim. People were always nominally Muslim. Perhaps they might call themselves culturally Muslim. But however, the practice and the awareness of it wasn't always there. And that's something they realized. And that was something they realized because identity options were closed to them. And one of the most common things the youth will say is that they seized on the label Muslim because it couldn't be challenged as an identity marker. So being British could be challenged. Well, where are you from? Britain. Where are you really from? London. No, where are you really from? And the question being, well, actually, you're Asian. Are you not from Asia? You know, regardless of the fact that it's 4 generations back since any of their family lived in Asia. So saying I'm Muslim and disregarding geographic labels was a lot easier for the Muslim youth. Another key issue that emerged was Islamic symbolism and its relationship to radicalism. So very simply, the more you looked like a Muslim, the more radical you were presumed to be. And that was a situation that occurred in the public space. And what I mean by public space is the outside of the multicultural, multi-faith communities in which the majority of these participants lived in. So once these people were outside of that kind of comfort zone, so to speak, they experienced those assumptions around whether or not they were radical based on their identity. Particularly, of course, an issue for females. And interestingly, and again, this was happening pre-9/11, but it's framed differently, Muslim female youth were wearing the hijab more likely than their parents were. And the reason they were wearing, I'm going to get onto that a little bit later, but the reason they were wearing the hijab more likely than their parents were is because the education they received around Islam. The parents, and particularly their mothers, the education they received would have been in the home. They would not have gone to the mosque. They would have not have gone to halakas to learn about Islam. They would not have had access to information online. They would not have learned about Islam from scholars who had grown up in the West. So there was a very different system of education for the Muslim youth. And that system of education allowed those women to apply that fundamentalist interpretation of Islam to their daily life. Again, not a pejorative use of the word fundamental. Becoming Muslim after 9/11, referred a little bit to that earlier, because identity options closed down, but also because of identity options hardening. They seized on that opportunity to take that label that nobody could challenge them on. They also became more aware. Another quote from one of the participants said, well, here were these guys drinking and renting cars on the weekend, but when it came to bin Laden, next thing they were his greatest advocate because he was one of us. And that's a really interesting thing. Another Pew poll said something like, do you support bin Laden? And of course, 17-year-old boys are going to say yes. And that type of information, you know, filtered all the way up. And it really informed our view on Muslim youth in the UK. And when you get into that kind of discussion and you ask them, well, tell me a little bit about why you support him, and they'll say, well, I don't really support him, but at least he's doing something. So it wasn't a measure of their support for radical Islam or their support for suicide bombing. It was support for action against what they saw as very, very harmful British policy action in Iraq and Afghanistan, wherever it happened to be. So the meaning behind the questions that they were asked really did not measure what it purported to measure at all. But that was lost in the terrorism studies and international relations literature. This ridiculous question about being Muslim first and ranking identity was a major, major feature, surprisingly a major feature in the study. The constant pressure to demonstrate Britishness was not about demonstrating Britishness, because if you say, well, tell me what's Britishness, fish and chips, pub on a Sunday, football. And you could literally be talking as superficial as that. When you spoke to the youth are you British? And they'd say, well, yeah, I'm British. It means a passport. It means democracy. You know, it means freedom to do what I want. It's all inclusive. You know, multicultural society. That's what Britishness is. What's Muslim? Muslim is day-to-day life. It's how I live, how I think about things. It's a guidance on my family. It's my culture. It's my heritage. So they're not the same thing. So when they're asked to rank them, it's not a reasonable question. So that meant absolutely nothing. However, it meant an awful lot in the literature on terrorism. It was demonstration that they rejected Britishness. In fact, what it demonstrated around fitting in, not about being British. It demonstrated an ignorance around the terms. It demonstrated an ignorance about what identity is in the first place, that you could possibly rank identity. Being Muslim and a portrayal of being Muslim, the public-private dichotomy. Talk a little bit more about that when we get to the next diagram, but what it means is that there was, if you asked those questions as an insider, you got a very different answer to if you asked those questions outside the forecourts when they were protesting about Babar Ahmed's deportation to America. And so you have almost a public world of being Muslim in Britain and a private world of being Muslim in Britain. And that was a very real distinction. And that was an ongoing distinction for the youth in the study. And they separated their lives into that public and private sphere. The emergence of a British Islam. I would quite confidently say there is such a thing as a British Islam. And what it means is that these people, these youth, are British. They compare themselves to their British peers. They don't compare themselves to their parents' generation or their peers in Pakistan or India. These are British youth. They've grown up in British schools. They only know English as a language, possibly maybe conversational language for their parents' generation. But the point being is that their interpretation of Islam is a British interpretation of Islam. And one of the comments about radicalization is that they're seeking to challenge their parents' interpretation of Islam. And this embrace of radicalism is evidence of that. In fact, the youth in this study would say that they have an acultural interpretation of Islam. What does that mean? It means they think that they stripped away their parents' heritage from Islam, from their parents' Islam, meaning things like kissing the feet of elderly relatives as a sign of respect, wearing a skull cap for the men. And they would say, well, actually, that's not said in the Hadith or the Quran, so that's sacrilege. That type of thing. So they're saying, well, we're stripping away the cultural baggage and we're just looking at a fundamentalist interpretation of Islam. But what they're actually doing is they're having a British interpretation of Islam. So they have things like, they'll argue with their parents about how as a female I can travel on my own because the Quran says I can travel 27 miles on my own without a male relative. So, and that's kind of coming onto the gender issue. British Islam, especially for these women, it's emancipatory. It's not a situation where they're, you know, they're being held, you know, under effective house arrest by their parents. This is a tool. This is a framework for them to be emancipated in British society. So if you think about and this is about British Muslim women operate under the cultural framework of their parents. So that's a framework of respect, and women normally carry in certain cultural traditions, women are very much carriers of their family respect. So. Engaging in what would be called Western behaviors would be very, very problematic for the immigrant families. However, if these Muslim females switch the framework from the cultural framework of their parents to Islam, that then maintains the respect, but gives them freedom because they're fighting with their parents for a British Islam. So they can do things like, they can go to university, because they can travel a certain distance on their own, because they're wearing the hijab, so the hijab allows them to integrate because they can be in spaces where there's males and females together. So it's actually a tool of emancipation for these women, and it's used in a very sophisticated manner to allow them to be British, to allow them to operate in Britain and to be included. So ironically, wearing the hijab for these Muslim women allows them to integrate into British society more fully. However, that's not how it's portrayed. For the men, the framework of Islam allows for young men who are really, you know, like I talked about, the folk devil of British society. It allows them to compare their experience, not to their white middle-class peers, but to other members of the Islamic community. They talk about how Islam provides information to science, how Islam is so important for maths and astrology, and how it's a foundational element of European society. And so they value that as a major part of British society. So they're saying, in fact, well, British society has learnt a lot from Islam, and so we're part of Islam in that way. So a different framework for seeing themselves as integrating. But again, you're seeing British Islam as being a tool for integration for both males and females. Intergenerational change, I referred a little bit earlier to the idea that Muslim youth today learn differently to their parents' generation. They also challenge their parents' generation because most likely the youth will know more about the Quran in terms of quoting text of the Quran to their parents, and their parents are most likely going to lose that argument about what they can and can't do using the framework of Islam. Mostly the women that will do that. And they're using tools of Britishness around critical thinking, etc. That's inspired by British teaching to take the Quran, argue with their parents for greater freedom to be involved in British society. But it's seen from external sources as, it's a backward step that Muslims are covering their heads. So the complexity in that is absolutely lost when we talk about radicalization, and we talk about fundamentalist interpretation of Islam, and we talk about increased piety for Muslim youth. The location of identity. Talked a little bit earlier about the notion of transnationalism. There's two key themes for the Muslim youth in this study. That's a local identity and a global identity. National identity is really quite problematic, and to all purposes they avoid it. So avoiding the debate on Britishness. They'll say, I'm a Londoner. 99% will say, I'm not English, that they can't relate to being English. They can be a Londoner. Yes, they can relate to Britishness, but they can certainly relate to being Muslim as a global or a transnational identity. So you see this very, very local identity, a very strong local identity of being British Islam, being a Londoner, and then this very strong transnational identity. Now, the transnational identity doesn't oftentimes have a lot of rootedness in a reality. It's kind of a romantic notion, an imagined community, but it is there. And it's there when they talk about the experience of Muslims in Bosnia, the experience of Muslims in Chechnya, the experience of Muslims in Iraq, Iran, all of those situations where you see oppression of Muslim communities globally. That's very much a day-to-day reality. And the interesting thing about that is the global and the local meet, because and it's something I'll talk about in grand narratives, but there's very much a conspiracy since 9/11 amongst Muslim youth as a narrative, a conspiracy of oppression of Muslims globally, mistreatment of Muslims globally. And they kind of buy into that idea that foreign policy, Western foreign policy, does in fact target British Muslims. And the local element of that is that their knowledge about Palestine, at the time of some of the interviews, the Lebanon incursion was underway. And they were hearing about events on the ground from their neighbours whose family were in Lebanon. So they were getting sources of information very, very locally from Urdu papers, from Arabic papers in London. All of that information was coming in a local way, but was global. So there was kind of this conspiracy that we couldn't believe the BBC because that wasn't telling the truth anyway, but their local knowledge was really, really important. So you had this local London or East London Tower Hamlets information that related to Lebanon and cut out the middleman, so to speak. So quite a complex kind of relationship there around the location of identity. And finally, the issue of grand narratives. I talked about conspiracy. I mean, some of the fascinating stories or quotes from the work were about the conspiracy theories around 9/11. They all said something about, well, how do they find the passports of the bombers or the suicide bombers when the whole plane blew up and the Twin Towers fell down? So they had all these little bits of information from various conspiracy websites, that there was George Bush used the term crusade against Islam, and that was true, and that was the case. And, not a lot of, some of it was very unreasonable, some of it was quite reasonable, and, suspicions about the sources of information. But another key narrative there was the notion of victimhood, and the notion that, yes, in fact, Muslims are victims of Western foreign policy. They are victims of Islamophobia and discrimination in the UK. They are the folk devils of British society because of the way they're treated. And what's important about that notion of victimhood is that, again, the local and the global combined. So the people in the study compared, for example, there was an affair in Forest Gate where 2 Muslim men were arrested in the middle of the night for suspected terrorist offences. Now, one of them was shot in the process of being arrested, and they were released without charge. It turned out that a neighbour had reported that they were making bombs in their bath. The Metropolitan Police sent in 250 police officers, closed the area, well, naturally when there was a suspected bomb, and I suppose somehow reasonably, but they shot one of the men because he was coming down the stairs because they went in at prayer time, etc. It turned into a fiasco. It turned into a public relations nightmare for the Metropolitan Police. But the point being is that they compared that experience of the treatment of Muslims in Forest Gate in London to Muslims in Afghanistan. So the kind of story was that, well, all Muslims are experiencing these problems. And other events, the deportation of Muslim suspects to the United States, all of those stories were evidence of this global situation where Muslims were being oppressed. Very problematically, and that narrative of victimhood was picked up by the radical groups. So you had Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan talking about the Forest Gate affair. So they said, well, look at the Muslims in Britain, look how they're being treated with this man being shot in Forest Gate. So you had a comparison across situations where very sophisticated use of the treatment of Muslims by these radical organizations, by Al-Qaeda, demonstrating that the Muslims in Afghanistan are the same as the Muslims in Britain and they're all being oppressed. So that narrative of victimhood is probably a reasonable narrative and it's a dominant narrative. However, it is absolutely being abused by the radical organizations to maintain their story, and their story of victimhood is quite important. I know this is a bit of a death by PowerPoint diagram, but just to sum up some of the key ideas, right-hand side, no. Right-hand side, public identity. This is the story that we witness in the public realm. This is the story we witness in academia. This is the story that academics and government talk about. It's the issue of identity denial, not being allowed to be British, closing of identity options, British Muslims as other, the securitization of identity, the securitization of immigration, the securitization of entire communities, fixed identity categories being the only options for individuals, the issue of ethnic identity and ethnic communities being securitized, being suspect, issues of minority and immigrant. That's all public sphere issues. That's where the media narratives dominate. On the other side, we have the personal identity, where we have the emergence of a British Islam, where we have the construction of a private British identity, where Britishness means something, but it doesn't quite mean what the public narrative wants it to mean. But there is an embracing of a Britishness in this. Now, personal identity might be an incorrect term, but in this personal sphere, there is a Britishness. There is an embracing of a British Islam. Quite important. And the place at which these two meet for the youth in this study is this expressed identity here. British Islam is the key to linking these two spaces and being able to understand how the personal space and the public space challenge and are problematizing each other. Understanding it, I think the answer is in the idea of British Islam. So going back to the first slide we talked about, now when we look at this list of what radicalization is supposedly, we can now tell you what it is not. It is not about immigrant history. It is not about notions of vulnerability. It is not about an identity crisis. This issue of global community versus statehood is about the day-to-day lived experience of being a Muslim youth in London, where your neighbours are from Lebanon, where your information about the world is localised. That's a normal part of that kind of globalized experience. So it's nothing to do with radicalization. Transnational identity features, attachment to the notion of the Ummah. That's only problematized for Muslim youth when we're talking about radicalization. It's not problematized for other imagined communities who exist, for example, online. It's not problematized for other communities that exist in other forums. Transgenerational conflict is a normal feature of youth development. So intergenerational conflict is a normal feature of youth development. This is something that is a normal process that we identify in all communities, immigrant or not. However, in this instance, ridiculous ideas that people are trying to challenge their parents' religious beliefs is somehow related to joining Al-Qaeda just to annoy your parents. Perceptions of injustice. Who joins Greenpeace? Young people. Who has perceptions of injustice around the war on terror? In fact, was it 1.5 million Britons had objections to the war on terror? Not all of them were young Muslims. However, notions of injustice are included in this story. Disenfranchised youth, that's a feature of immigrant populations in the UK, and a radical ideology doesn't actually feature very prominently in the initial stages of getting involved. So that's the story of what radicalization is not. hopefully it gives you some idea of how we should be thinking about terrorism. Of course, the point being is, do we consider radicalization related to terrorism? But that's, we'll take some questions on some of those issues now.
Before we thank you again, sometimes this is forgotten, but I think this is kind of an interesting thing. So the standard gift for other speakers is a psychology and neuroscience mug, which I think is a particularly interesting kind of potentially identity-threatening gift. It is particularly, but it's not meant that way.
I'll keep it on my desk where everybody can see it.
Meant as a sign of our respect.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So, as normal, we gathering together now and start drinking some drinks and